I never expected that a university thesis would change my life, but that's exactly what happened when I lingered after office hours. For months, my world had been confined to the dusty corners of the library and the quiet hum of my laptop, a predictable rhythm of study and solitude. But one request, born of academic desperation, ended up closing a distance I never even knew I wanted to cross. It started with a professor, a stack of books, and the slow, quiet unfolding of something I was terrified to even name. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 21, a final-year history major drowning in the research for my senior thesis. My life had a certain monastic quality to it. I woke up, went to classes in the gray stone buildings of the university, spent 8 hours in the hushed cathedral of the main library, and then went home to a small, quiet apartment that I shared with no one. It wasn't a bad life, just a narrow one. It was a life built around discipline and routine, mostly because I was afraid of what might happen if I let things get messy. The world outside my academic bubble felt loud and complicated. Romance, to me, was something that happened in the novels I read for my literature electives, not something that felt possible in my own muted existence. I was observant but passive, a spectator in my own life. I watched other students fall in and out of love, their lives vibrant dramas of connection and heartbreak, while mine just ticked along. I told myself I was focused. I told myself I didn't have time. The truth was, I was lonely, in a quiet, unassuming way that had become so familiar it almost felt comfortable. The center of my academic world, and the unwitting catalyst for everything that came next, was Professor Julian Croft. He was new to the history department that year, a specialist in 19th century European social movements. He couldn't have been much older than 30 or 32, but he carried himself with an easy confidence that made him seem both ageless and entirely in command of his world. His lectures weren't just informative, they were performances. He would pace in front of the lecture hall, hands gesturing, his voice rising and falling with the drama of the Paris Commune or the fervor of the Italian Risorgimento. He had dark, thick hair that always seemed to be slightly tousled, as if he'd just run his hands through it while wrestling with a complex idea. He had kind eyes, a warm shade of brown that seemed to hold a genuine spark of intellectual curiosity. He was, in a word, captivating. To me, he was less of a man and more of an ideal, the embodiment of the academic life I thought I wanted. He was brilliant, passionate, and completely, utterly unattainable. He was a professor, and I was just another face in a sea of students, scribbling down his every word. I'd sit in the third row, always in the same seat, and feel a strange pull. It wasn't just academic admiration, though there was plenty of that. It was something more personal. It was the way he'd pause and look out over the lecture hall, his gaze seeming to sweep right over me, and I'd feel a ridiculous jolt, a foolish hope that for a single second, he had actually seen me. Not just a student, but me, Lucas. Of course, he never did. He was just thinking, gathering his thoughts before launching into his next point. But I collected those moments like treasured secrets. My thesis was on the role of underground printers and radical pamphleteers during the German revolutions of 1848. It was a topic I was passionate about, but it was also incredibly niche. The sources were obscure, many of them untranslated, buried in archives I could only access through grainy microfiche. For weeks, I felt like I was hitting a wall. My arguments were flimsy, my evidence was thin, and the deadline was looming like an executioner's axe. Panic began to set in, a cold dread that I was going to fail the single most important project of my university career. I knew I needed help. I knew I needed an expert eye. And the foremost expert I knew was Professor Croft. His official office hours were Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 4. I'd walked past his open door a dozen times during those hours, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. I'd see another student in there with him, leaning forward earnestly as he explained a concept, and I would lose my nerve and walk away. What could I possibly say? Professor, I'm lost. My entire thesis is a mess. Please help me. It felt like an admission of complete and utter failure. The fear of his judgment was almost as strong as my fear of failing the class. He was so brilliant, so effortlessly intelligent. I imagined he'd never struggled with an academic concept in his life. I pictured him looking at my disorganized notes and half-formed chapters with a kind of detached pity, and the thought was mortifying. So I kept telling myself I could figure it out on my own. I spent another week in the library, fueled by caffeine and anxiety, and only dug myself into a deeper hole. Finally, one Tuesday afternoon, the desperation won. I stood outside his office for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the doorframe. I could hear his low, calm voice inside. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of old books and floor wax, and knocked gently on the open door. The student inside was gathering their things, and Professor Croft looked up. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I felt my resolve crumble. "Lucas, right?" he asked. His voice was even warmer up close. I was stunned that he knew my name. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. "Yes, Professor. I, was wondering if you had a minute." "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair the other student had just vacated. "Come in. Close the door if you'd like." I didn't close the door. Leaving it open felt like a safety measure, a tether to the normal, anonymous world of the hallway. I sat down, my backpack heavy on my lap, and fumbled with the straps. I explained my predicament in a halting, roundabout way, my voice sounding small and thin in the quiet office. I talked about the lack of sources, the difficulty of tracing the networks of these revolutionary printers, the feeling that my central argument was collapsing. He listened patiently, his chin resting on his hand. He didn't interrupt. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. When I finally ran out of words, stumbling into an apologetic silence, he leaned forward slightly. I braced myself for the gentle dismissal, the suggestion that perhaps I'd chosen a topic that was too ambitious. Instead, he said, "It sounds fascinating and difficult. Those are often the most rewarding projects." He paused, looking at my stack of messy, dog-eared notes I'd placed on his desk. "But you're right. You're at a critical point. Standard office hours aren't going to be enough to untangle this." My heart sank. This was it, the polite rejection. "Here's what we'll do," he continued, and the certainty in his voice startled me. "My schedule is packed during the day, but my evenings are clearer. How about we meet a couple of times a week, after 5? We can spread your work out on the big table and really dig into it." My treat. "I find this stuff just as interesting as you do." I was speechless. It was an offer of such generosity, so far beyond what I had any right to expect, that I couldn't immediately process it. After-hours sessions, alone with him, in his office. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a lifeline. Are you sure, Professor?" I stammered. "I don't want to impose on your time." He smiled, a small, genuine smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "It wouldn't be an imposition, Lucas. It would be a pleasure. How about we start this Thursday? Say 5:30. I nodded, feeling a dizzying wave of relief wash over me. I managed to thank him, gathered my things, and practically floated out of his office. As I walked down the empty hallway, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall, arched windows, I felt a tremor of something new. It wasn't just relief. It was hope, a dangerous, fragile, and utterly thrilling hope that had very little to do with my thesis. Our first evening session felt clandestine. The history building was nearly empty, the usual daytime bustle replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The only sounds were the distant hum of the cleaning crew's floor polisher and the soft click of my own footsteps on the linoleum. His office door was ajar, a warm slice of yellow light spilling into the dim hallway. It felt like an invitation into a secret world. "Come in, Lucas." "Julian," Professor Croft said as I appeared in the doorway. He was standing by a bookshelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume. He was no longer in the tweed jacket he wore to lectures, but a simple gray sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. I was just pulling something I thought might be useful. I stepped inside, and he closed the door behind me. The soft click of the latch seemed to amplify the quiet in the room. This time, it didn't feel like a safety measure being removed. It felt like the world being shut out. We were in our own little bubble, surrounded by towering shelves of books that smelled of history and dust and time. The air was warm and still. We spent the first hour focused entirely on my thesis. We laid my notes and printouts across the large wooden table in the center of the room. He moved with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read through my chaotic paragraphs. He didn't criticize. Instead, he asked questions. "What are you trying to argue here? What if you approached it from this angle?" He had a way of making me feel like the ideas were mine, even when he was the one gently guiding me toward them. As the evening wore on, the conversation began to drift. He pointed to a framed photograph on his desk of a beautiful, rugged coastline. "That's the west coast of Ireland," he said, his voice softer now. "My family is from there. I try to go back every couple of years. It helps me reset." "It's beautiful," I said genuinely. It was a small opening, a glimpse into his life beyond these academic walls. I wanted to ask more, but I felt too shy. He seemed to sense my hesitation. "What about you, Lucas? What do you do to reset? When you're not agonizing over 19th century German radicals?" That is, he said it with a light, teasing tone that made me smile. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I just read. Or go for long walks without any particular destination." It sounded lame and solitary compared to flying to Ireland. "There's nothing wrong with that," he said, his gaze steady and kind. "Sometimes the quietest pursuits are the most necessary, and in that moment, I felt seen. Not just as a struggling student, but as a person. The professional distance between us seemed to shrink, just for a second. During our second session, a week later, it started to rain. A sudden, torrential downpour that lashed against the old window panes of his office. The sound wrapped around us, isolating us even further. About an hour in, he stood up and went to a small cabinet in the corner. "I'm making some tea," he announced. "Would you like a cup? It's a miserable night out there." "Oh yes, thank you," I said, surprised by the simple, domestic gesture. "Milk? Sugar? Just a little milk, please." He returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs. He placed one in front of me, the warmth seeping through the ceramic. We worked for another hour, the tea a comforting presence between us. The conversation flowed more easily this time, weaving back and forth between the intricacies of German history and our own lives. I learned he was from a small town in Ohio, that he'd felt like an outsider in graduate school, and that he sometimes missed the anonymity of being a student. He confessed that being a new professor was lonelier than he'd expected. "You're in this strange middle ground," he explained, staring into his mug. "You're not quite a peer to the older, tenured faculty, but you're certainly not a friend to your students. It's isolating." This was the moment his carefully constructed facade of effortless confidence crumbled away for me. He was just a person, with his own anxieties and insecurities. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also vulnerable. That revelation was more intoxicating than any academic praise he could have given me. It made him feel real. It made the hopeless, foolish crush I was developing feel a little less hopeless. Towards the end of that evening, as I was packing my bag, I noticed he was looking at the worn-out sleeve of my jacket. "You must have been freezing when you came in," he said, a small frown creasing his brow. "That jacket doesn't look very warm." Before I could respond, he had taken off his own gray sweater and was holding it out to me. "Here," he said. "Take this. You can give it back to me next time." I was stunned into silence. "Oh, no, I couldn't," I protested, my face flushing with heat. "I'm fine, really." "Don't be ridiculous, Lucas," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's cold and it's raining. Just take it." He draped it over my arm, his fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. The touch was electric, a tiny spark that shot straight up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I mumbled my thanks, my mind reeling. I walked home through the rain, clutching his sweater to my chest. It was still warm from his body and smelled faintly of him, a scent of old books, tea, and something uniquely his own. That night, I didn't sleep with it. That would have been too much, but I did fold it carefully and place it on the chair next to my bed. It was a tangible piece of evidence, a sign that the kindness I was seeing wasn't just in my head. A small, significant gesture that my hopeful heart magnified into something much, much bigger. The final session before my thesis was due arrived on a cold, clear night. The pressure was immense. This was our last scheduled meeting, the last guaranteed reason I had to be alone with him in the quiet sanctuary of his office. I felt a sense of impending loss that was sharp and painful. The thesis itself almost felt like an afterthought, a mere excuse for these moments of connection. We worked for hours, fueled by a fresh pot of tea and a shared sense of urgency. Julian was incredible, his mind sharp and incisive, cutting through my tangled prose to find the clear, strong arguments hidden within. He was more than a teacher. He was a collaborator, a partner in this intellectual endeavor. The air in the room was thick with concentration, but underneath it, something else was simmering, a tension that had been building for weeks. It was well past 10 o'clock when my body finally gave out. The words on the page started to swim, blurring into meaningless black squiggles. My head felt heavy, my eyelids like lead weights. I propped my chin in my hand, trying to focus on Julian's voice as he explained a final point, but the sound was becoming a distant, soothing drone. I must have blinked, just for a moment, but when I opened my eyes again, the room was soft and fuzzy around the edges. "Lucas." His voice was gentle, pulling me back from the brink of sleep. "You're exhausted. Let's call it a night. You've done more than enough." I tried to protest, to say I was fine, but the words came out as a mumbled slur. I slumped forward, resting my forehead on my crossed arms on the table, the wood cool against my skin. "Just for a minute," I whispered, mostly to myself. The scent of old paper and wood polish was comforting, and I let myself drift, just for a second. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been 30 seconds or 10 minutes. But what woke me wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a slow, incredibly gentle pressure, as if a single finger was tracing a line through my hair, pushing a stray strand away from my forehead. It was the lightest touch imaginable, hesitant and impossibly tender. My eyes snapped open. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The touch lingered for another heartbeat, a warm, living presence against my skin, and then it was gone. Slowly, I lifted my head. Julian wasn't behind his desk. He was sitting in the chair right next to mine, the one I'd left empty. He was leaning forward, his arms still outstretched, his hand now hovering in the air between us as if he'd been caught in the middle of a forbidden act. His face was just inches from mine. The air between us was electric, humming with everything that had gone unsaid for weeks. His eyes, so often warm and animated, were now dark and intense, filled with an expression I couldn't decipher. It looked like a mixture of concern, curiosity, and something deeper, something more vulnerable. It was the kind of look that bypasses all conversation and speaks directly to the soul. We just stared at each other, the silence in the room so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The world seemed to have shrunk to the space between our faces. He was the one who broke the spell. He pulled his hand back abruptly and cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He stood up, putting the physical distance of the desk between us again, as if trying to reset the boundaries I now realized he had so carefully, so deliberately, crossed. "You should get some sleep, Lucas," he said, his voice strained, unfamiliar. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was busy shuffling papers on his desk that didn't need shuffling. "Your thesis is in excellent shape. Just read it over one more time in the morning and get it submitted." The intimacy of the moment had vanished, shattered into a million awkward pieces. The warmth was gone, replaced by a sudden, chilling formality. I felt a flush of shame and confusion. Had I imagined it? Had he simply been trying to wake me, and I had invested the simple gesture with a meaning that wasn't there? "Right. Yes. Thank you," I stammered, scrambling to gather my things. My hands were shaking. I couldn't look at him. I shoved my laptop into my bag, dropped a pen, and fumbled to pick it up. The entire time, he remained behind his desk, a silent, imposing figure. I practically fled his office, mumbling a hasty goodbye without making eye contact. Walking down the deserted hallway, the cool night air felt like a slap in the face. My mind was racing, replaying the moment of that gentle touch over and over again. The tenderness of it. The look in his eyes when I woke up. It had felt so real, so significant. But his swift retreat, his sudden coldness, told a different story. It was a story of regret, of a line crossed and immediately regretted. And that thought was more devastating than anything. I submitted my thesis the next day. The act of dropping it into the submission slot felt painfully final. It was over. There were no more excuses, no more late-night sessions, no more reasons to be in his orbit. In the week that followed, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I went to my other classes, I ate, I slept, but my mind was elsewhere. It was back in that quiet office, trapped in that single, charged moment. My internal monologue became a relentless, torturous loop. I was a detective and a prosecutor in the court of my own anxiety. The evidence was presented, the gentle touch. Exhibit A. What did it mean? The prosecution argued it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a professor's paternalistic concern that went a step too far. He felt pity for the exhausted student and immediately regretted the overly familiar gesture. His abruptness afterwards was proof of his discomfort. He was probably hoping I would just forget it ever happened. But then the defense would take the stand, fueled by a stubborn, desperate hope. It would replay the look in his eyes. That wasn't pity. It was something else, something deeper. The defense argued that the touch was intentional, a tentative question asked without words. His retreat wasn't about regret, it was about fear. Fear of the professional consequences, fear of his own feelings, fear of my reaction. He had revealed too much, and it had scared him. I walked past the history building several times, telling myself I was just taking a shortcut, but I knew I was hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Once, I saw him walking across the campus green, talking with another professor. He was laughing, looking completely at ease, back to being the confident, unattainable man from my lectures. He didn't see me. I felt a pang of such acute foolishness that it nearly took my breath away. Of course it was all in my head. I was just a student with a crush, weaving fantasies out of a simple act of kindness. To protect myself from further humiliation, I decided to accept the prosecution's version of events. It was the safer, more logical conclusion. He had been kind, I had been overwrought and sleep-deprived, and I had built a castle of hope on a foundation of sand. I resolved to put it behind me, to file it away with all the other foolish, secret longings of my life. It was better to live with a quiet, manageable disappointment than to cling to a hope that was almost certainly false. This resolution lasted for about 4 days. Then, an email notification popped up on my phone. The subject line was simple, thesis grade. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just about the grade anymore. This was the final, official link to him, and I was terrified to open it. I let it sit there for an hour before I finally found the courage to look. I had received the highest possible mark. Attached was a short, formal note from the grading committee, and underneath it, a personal message from Julian. It read, "Lucas, a truly outstanding piece of scholarship. One of the best undergraduate theses I've had the pleasure of supervising in years. You should be incredibly proud. JC." Reading his words, I felt a confusing mix of pride and a deep, aching sadness. He was proud of my work. He was still my professor, my supervisor. The formal tone, the JC initials, it all felt like a confirmation. The line was firmly back in place. The brief, confusing moment of intimacy was forgotten, at least on his end. But despite my resolve to let it go, I knew I couldn't leave it like this. I owed him a proper thank you. Not for the grade, but for the hours he'd invested, for the tea, for his kindness, for everything. My fingers trembled as I typed out a reply. It was short, polite, and carefully professional. I thanked him for his guidance and his praise. Then, on a wave of what felt like either bravery or insanity, I added a final sentence. "I'd love to thank you in person if you have a spare moment this week." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, my stomach churning with dread. The reply came back in less than 5 minutes. It was so fast it made my head spin. His message was just one line. "Of course. Come by my office on Friday. After 5 would be best." After 5. The words echoed in my mind. Not during his regular office hours. Not in the bustling middle of the day. He was inviting me back into that quiet, after-hours world where the boundaries had blurred so spectacularly. Hope, that stubborn, treacherous thing, flared back to life inside me, brighter and more terrifying than ever. Friday arrived with agonizing slowness. I spent the entire day in a fog of nervous anticipation. What was I going to say? "Thanks for the help. And by the way, did you or did you not touch my hair in a way that has completely ruined my ability to think about anything else?" It was absurd. I decided I would just thank him, hand him back his folded gray sweater which I had brought with me in my backpack, and leave. It would be a clean, mature end to the whole affair. At 5:15, I stood outside his office door once again. This time, it was closed. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung inward. He was standing there, as if he had been waiting for me. "Lucas," he said. His voice was quiet, low. "I'm glad you came." He stepped back to let me in, and I walked into the familiar, book-lined room. But the atmosphere was completely different. He hadn't turned on the main overhead light, and the office was cast in the soft, warm glow of a single desk lamp. He wasn't behind his desk. He was just standing in the middle of the room, a few feet from me. The air was heavy with unspoken words. He closed the door, and then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He walked to the large window that overlooked the campus green and slowly, deliberately, closed the blinds. The metallic rattle of the slats sliding shut was the only sound. The room was plunged into an even deeper, more intimate twilight. He turned back to face me, his silhouette framed by the faint light filtering through the edges of the blinds. "I don't think you're here to talk about your thesis grade," he said. It wasn't a question. My carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. All I could do was shake my head, my throat too tight to speak. He took a step closer, closing half the distance between us. "Lucas, I need to be honest with you. And I need to apologize. The way I acted the other night, after you fell asleep, it was abrupt and cold, and that wasn't fair to you." He paused, and his gaze was so intense it felt like he was looking straight into me. "The extra help," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't just about your thesis. I mean, it was at first. But then, it became an excuse. An excuse to spend time with you. To get to know the quiet, brilliant man who sat in the third row of my lecture and looked at the world with such thoughtful eyes. Every word was a detonation in my quiet, terrified heart. It was real. None of it had been in my head. He had seen me. He had felt it, too. I've been struggling with this for months," he confessed, taking another step. He was so close now I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "There are lines you're not supposed to cross. A professor and a student. It's a minefield. Every time I found myself wanting to talk to you for a minute too long, or every time I made tea hoping you'd stay a little later, I felt like I was breaking a rule. That night, when I touched your hair, that was me finally admitting to myself that I didn't care about the rules anymore. And it scared me, so I pushed you away. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, it felt like I could dissolve into it. The anxiety I had carried for weeks simply washed away, replaced by a giddy, terrifying clarity. I finally found my voice. I thought I imagined it. I whispered. I thought I had made it all up. I fumbled with my backpack and pulled out his neatly folded sweater. "I came to give this back." He looked at the sweater, then back at me, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. It was the most genuine smile I had ever seen from him. "You can keep it," he said softly. He closed the final inches between us, and his hands came up to gently cup my face. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was firm, sure, and breathtakingly warm. I was so afraid I'd misread everything. "You didn't," I breathed, my own hands finding their way to his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "You didn't misread anything." He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the chaste, tentative touch to my forehead. This was a real kiss, confident and searching and full of all the pent-up longing and unspoken confessions of the past few months. It was a kiss that tasted of relief and recognition. It was the end of the speculation and the beginning of everything else. In the quiet, dimly lit office, with the world shut out, he had closed the final, most impossible distance of all. The weeks that followed my graduation were a blur of firsts. Our first real date, off campus, in a noisy Italian restaurant where he was no longer Professor Croft, but just Julian. He told me about his childhood. I told him about my anxieties, and we laughed, amazed at how easy it was to talk now that the formal barrier between us was gone. Our first time walking down the street holding hands, a simple act that felt like a bold declaration to the world. He helped me move out of my sterile, quiet apartment and into a new one closer to the city center, where I was starting an internship at a historical society. He carried boxes, assembled bookshelves, and filled my new space with a warmth and laughter it had never known. We were learning the rhythm of each other, the small domestic habits and quirks that make up the fabric of a shared life. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he cooked, and that he was fiercely competitive at board games. He learned that I needed a quiet hour in the morning with a book and a cup of coffee before I could face the day. It was strange and wonderful to see him outside the context of the university. The brilliant, slightly intimidating professor was also a man who loved bad action movies, who got endearingly flustered when he couldn't find his keys, and who had a surprisingly gentle touch. The person I had built up in my head was replaced by someone far more complex, more human, and infinitely more lovable. My quiet, narrow world had expanded, its colors becoming richer and more vibrant than I had ever imagined possible. A few months after graduation, near the end of the summer, Julian asked me to help him pack up his office for the break. He was moving to a larger one in the fall, a perk of his growing seniority. Walking back into that familiar room felt like stepping into a memory. The bookshelves were half empty now, and cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls. The late afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. We worked in a comfortable silence for a while, packing books into boxes, the scent of old paper filling the room once more. I picked up a heavy volume on the 1848 revolutions and smiled to myself. It all felt like a lifetime ago. Julian came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "What are you smiling about?" he murmured, his voice warm against my ear. "Just thinking," I said, leaning back against him, "about how terrified I was the first time I came in here. How I thought my life was over because of a thesis." He chuckled softly. And I was on the other side of this desk, trying to act like a calm, professional academic, when all I could think about was how I was going to find an excuse to see you again. He turned me around to face him. He had a playful, nostalgic glint in his eye. He walked over to the window, and with a soft rattle, he closed the blinds, plunging the room into that same intimate twilight from the day of his confession. He walked back to me, a slow smile on his face. "You know," he said, taking my face in his hands, "I think this is my favorite time of day in here." He kissed me, a long, slow, comfortable kiss that was full of shared history and the promise of a future. There was no tension anymore, no fear, just the deep, steady certainty of being known and loved. It's funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? You can build walls around your heart, convinced you're keeping yourself safe, convinced that your small, predictable world is all you need. You tell yourself that grand, sweeping feelings are for other people. But all it really takes is one person who is willing to see past the walls, who recognizes the quiet longing behind your eyes. All it takes is a moment of vulnerability, a single brave step into the unknown, to discover a life bigger and more beautiful than you ever dared to hope for. Love, I learned, isn't always a loud declaration. Sometimes it begins in the quiet, in a shared glance across a room, in a gentle touch, in the simple, hopeful act of lingering just a little while longer.